Dr. Alan Keyes was recently in Memphis, and I put together an opportunity for he and I to give public speeches in a local church. Today, you get to hear Dr. Alan Keyes on the Voice of Resistance.
Those who forsake the law praise the wicked. Those who uphold the law resist them. Welcome to the Voice of Resistance. Here's your host, Randall Terry.
Welcome to the program, friend. If you have never heard Dr. Alan Keyes speak, you're in for a treat. And I'll tell you, he was kind of low-key in the speech that he gave in Memphis. But I will tell you honestly, I think that he is one of the best public speakers alive on the planet today. And you'll notice he doesn't have a note with him, all right? It's all coming from his heart and from his head and from years of study. He's just a brilliant man and a great political analyst and a very inspirational speaker. And I'm delighted to bring to you Dr. Alan Keyes. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Alan Keyes, Ambassador Alan Keyes, former presidential candidate Alan Keyes. If I could use one phrase, and I've thought about this on many occasions, how do you define this man? First of all, it would be very difficult. It would take a long time, but it could be in this. A man is known by the enemies he keeps. A man is known by the people who don't invite him to the party. Right? Jesus said, "Blessed are you when men hate you, revile you, say all manner of evil against you falsely, separate you from their company." Right? For righteousness' sake, because you did the right thing. He said, in that day, leap for joy. Blessed are you. You're like the prophets who were before you. That's the way they treated the prophets. Leap for joy. You've got a great reward in heaven. That passage in both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke can, in many ways, sum up Dr. Keyes' prophetic voice to this nation. Fearless in his proclamation of the truth, and therefore, he has the right enemies. He has the people who should not like what he's saying, not liking him. So, and then I will also say that in personally, on many occasions when I was in a pickle, he was there. He was there. He was the Good Samaritan. He was the one who said, all right, I've got other plans, but I'm going to suspend my plans and I'm going to take this guy out of the ditch, put him on the mule at my own expense, take him to the inn. He helped. He was there. So it is an honor and a delight for me to introduce, and I promise an honor and a delight for you to hear, Ambassador Dr. Alan Keyes. Nice changes.
Thank you very much. Well, I do have to admit that over the course of the last several years, as Randall describes it, I have been blessed by God abundantly. Because there's been much reviling and abusing going on in various ways, though not as much as might be expected in some ways. And it is certainly true that I have made adversaries and enemies in all quarters. And I want to spend a little while thinking through, not so much in my own case, but why in general that may be in our time and what it signifies for us, both as people who are followers of Jesus Christ and especially today as Americans who are in the midst of a desperate struggle for the nation's survival, which I believe will come to a head, not in 10 years or 5 years, but now. The voting we do, the decisions we take, the people that end up in our institutions of government power are going to determine the future. And the consequences may not be fully worked out for 5 or 10 years, but the decisions we take will be decisive now. And we won't have an opportunity to take them again, I don't believe, because the institutions by which we take those decisions are already being perverted, hijacked, and destroyed. We don't have much time left. But in order to understand why that should be of significance to us, I think we have to confirm that we are, in fact, still people who believe that the fate of the United States of America is important. I don't take that for granted, by the way, because when I was going to graduate school years ago, that's several decades now, by the way, ago, it was already fashionable to talk about the end of the nation state and how the elite's job was to be the vanguard taking America and the world forward into a world where national boundaries and nationalities would no longer be of any importance. It's something that can sound good only if you honestly believe that the differences among nations have now reached the stage where they make no difference.
Hey, everyone's been asking me, when's Unstoppable coming out on DVD? Well, it's here. And I have created my own deluxe signature version of Unstoppable that contains not only the movie, but over 5 hours of additional curriculum and study guides for your family. It's perfect for your homeschool, educational facility, small group Bible study, and family devotions. And I'm going to share with you some of the spiritual warfare that surrounded the release of this film. This box set also includes extended scenes, new music videos, the inside scoop on the whole Facebook controversy. So what are you waiting for? I made this special version with my family in mind, and I know your family will be blessed by it too. Unstoppable 2.0 Deluxe Signature Version, available only here at KurtCameron.com. I can't wait for you to experience what's inside.
But I think we can survey the scene of nations around the world and starkly see the difference between nations that are ruled by totalitarian tyrants with no thought but power, by gangster oligarchies with no thought but wealth and power, and see the difference between how they will treat human beings and how human beings must suffer and how human beings must destroy their spirits and their families and their souls in order to prosper. And the nation that we once confidently were, in which, though like all other peoples on the face of the earth, we had good folks and bad folks, the good folks had every reason to believe that the law would protect them, that the economy would welcome them, that they would be able not to be reviled and abused for the sake of their will to do what is right, but instead they would enjoy the opportunities that God intends for those who observe His will. Now, why was that? Why would this, in particular, have been a country in which those who are willing to do what is right would know that they would have a defense in the law and a land where their righteousness, and that's the word we should use, would be respected and even preferred to positions of representation and decision-making in this society? I want to take a few minutes today to step back and take a look at the reason, the underlying reason, why that was characteristic of America. And why even when there were practices and other things like slavery being sanctioned in this country, the founders themselves understood that those institutions were doomed, or else the country would be doomed. When Jefferson looked at slavery, even though he himself was part of that structure and that institution in the state of Virginia, he didn't say, well, slavery is going to be around and America's going to accept it and we're going to build a great and powerful nation in which slavery is going to endure. He didn't believe that. In light of the premises and principles that the nation was founded on, when he wrote his famous tract, The Notes on Virginia, he took note of the issue of slavery and the deep roots and the deep problems that it posed for people in the United States, and he said, "I tremble for my country when I think that God is just, and that his justice will not sleep forever." Interesting, isn't it? That's Thomas Jefferson. According to all these people who promote the lie of separation of church and state and it's somehow being required by the Constitution, he's the one they always quote. He's the one who gave the famous letter to the Anabaptist in which he used the phrase of separation of church and state that's supposed to mean that we can't mention God and can't refer to God and don't have any right to speak of the authority of God when we are dealing with justice and law in this country. And yet there he is in the notes of Virginia, and he's looking at the future of America, and he's trembling for his country because he fears the justice of God. Was that American or un-American for Jefferson to do that? See, I think that it was thoroughly American, and so did he. And I can prove it. I can prove it. Because insofar as by American I mean typical and characteristic of the people of the United States of America, I know exactly when that people came into existence. I know exactly when they first appeared on the world stage as a free and independent nation. And I know the terms on which they proclaimed their identity and their will and their sense of what it was that both motivated and characterized their action, because it was all stated in that famous document, the Declaration of Independence. And the fundamental truth that was set down as the premise of their identity was not something that you'd understand, I guess, from the way people go on these days in all the various parts of the political spectrum, because they didn't go on about jobs, and they didn't go on about health care and all of these other things. What did they say? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what they said. And in the preface to those famous words, where they actually...
My wife and I, for 5 years, have been grinding our own wheat and baking our own bread from scratch. Within 2 hours, you can have fresh wheat in your hand and then piping hot bread come out of the oven. The most nutritious and delicious bread you will ever have. And we do it for under $1 a loaf. Call Paula's Bread and find out about this grain mill and the mixer and how it can save you money and change your life.
Said that they thought that people of the United States are in a right, ought to be free and independent. What did they say? They appealed to the laws of nature and of nature's God. They didn't say, get God out of here. We're not acting for the sake of God. We have no regard for God. They said God is the supreme judge. That's how he was described, the supreme judge of the world. And it was with a due regard for his judgment that they proclaimed the reasons for their action. And it was on a firm belief and reliance in his divine providence that they moved forward to prosecute what they knew would be an inevitable war in which they would begin with the greatest disadvantages and no hope of victory but in that righteous goodwill of God. You see? That's what it was about. That's what they said. They began from the premise of God. And what is it that we receive from God? It's the other thing nobody wants to talk about now, but which I think is so critical. Today, if you ask people what America is about, the first word likely to come out of their mouths is freedom. Freedom. A word that when you stand back and think about, what is freedom? Well, freedom essentially means two things. The ability to go on doing what you're doing. We generally refer to that as freedom, right? But it also refers to the opportunity to choose between alternatives in such a way that the alternative you choose will be the one you follow. That's freedom. It refers to an opportunity to act and an opportunity to choose freely, according to the disposition of your own will. That's interesting. Is freedom really what America's about? I mean, what's really fascinating is that they say that the people of the United States are and of right ought to be free. These states are and of right ought to be free and independent states. But when it comes to defining justice, they don't use the word freedom. They use the word, first of all, rights. And when they describe the purpose of government, they don't say the purpose of government so everybody can have freedom. They don't say that. They say to secure these rights, unalienable rights that come from the hand of Almighty God, to secure, make safe, make it so that people can hold on to these rights. That's why governments are instituted. The purpose of government is to secure the rights of people. Now, you'll say, but Alan, raise my hand. Rights are freedoms. Everybody says so. You listen to all the politicians, you listen to Rand Paul and everybody else, they act as if, they speak as if the word freedom and the word right are interchangeable. You just say freedoms, you say rights, you mean the same thing. Is that true? Can't possibly be true. Can't possibly be true. And it can't possibly be true for a reason that's evident to logic. It may very well be true that every right involves an exercise of freedom. How many of you would make bold to say that every freedom involves an exercise of right? See, suddenly you're having to pause. You're having to pause because you see, oh, wait a minute. When I use the word right, I'm adding something. When I use the word right, I'm not just referring to the freedom to do something. I'm referring to the fact that what you are doing with right. You have the right on your side when you do it. So our founders didn't speak just of freedom, they spoke of right. And they not only spoke of right, they spoke of God-endowed right. What does God-endowed mean? Well, let's take a look at endowments. What's an endowment? Well, generally speaking, we have the word very familiar to us in the way that people will endow a university with funds, right? They will sometimes give an endowment or set up an endowment at a university. Now, in the same way that every right is an exercise of freedom, but every freedom is not the exercise of right, every endowment is a gift, but not every gift is an endowment. What's the difference? Well, very often, an endowment is going to come for a specific purpose with conditions that are set in order to achieve that purpose. So that when you give that endowment, you are actually also establishing a structure, a framework.
What is the purpose of righteous government? And when is it appropriate for people to revolt against their government? I answer these questions and many others in my book, The Sword, which I wrote when I was a federal prisoner. Rob Shearer, the owner of Greenleaf Press, says this is one of the 10 most important books that a Christian can read today. If you want a book that is timely and timeless in its principles regarding government and revolution, get a copy of The Sword.
A rule, if you like, that then governs the way in which the resources that you have placed and made available in the endowment are going to be used. So the endowment is actually also a rule. And when God endows us with our rights, what's he doing? He's filling us up somehow with a content. And I've noticed that many people have a hard time with this. What on earth can it mean that God endows us with rights? You know, he gives us rights. It's, sometimes they want to talk as if he's given us an apple or something, when a right isn't like that. It's not a tangible, material object, is it? No. So, Alan, what is a right? How can we make sense of it? Well, I think the first thing that you can do to make sense of it is to ask yourself a simple question, which will help us to think this through. We are all familiar with the Bill of Rights, in which certain things are outlined, where it said that the government shall not do certain things and shall not infringe upon certain activities, and so forth and so on, which are included in our Constitution now. I once got into a dialogue with a young lady. I think it was in New Hampshire at one of the gatherings I participated in when I was involved in the presidential race there. And at one point in our exchange and discussion, we came onto this question of rights, and she asked me why it is that I was always talking about the Declaration and unalienable rights. And I tried to explain it to her. And while we were having a little back and forth conversation, I finally looked at her and I asked her, okay, where do our rights come from? I asked her. And she gave an answer, by the way, that is quite common these days, especially among the miseducated young who have been indoctrinated in schools that are no longer willing to go back and take a look at our history. Because they tell folks that our rights come from the Bill of Rights, and that's what she told me. She said, our rights come from the Bill of Rights. Our rights, therefore, come from the Constitution, right? And by the way, don't act as if this young lady is all isolated over there in her ignorance by herself because she was only in high school and stuff. Because if you ask most of our politicians and most of our leaders all the way up and down the line in America where our rights come from, they too will try to tell you that rights come from the Constitution. Rights come from God. Rights come from the decisions of the Supreme Court. But then a question arises. Before we had a Bill of Rights, before it was written, before it was put together and passed in Congress, and then ratified by people around the country, how did the people who sat down and said, okay, we need a Bill of Rights, let's set down these rights that government has to respect, how did they know how to recognize them? How did they find them? How did they derive them so that they could list them out and say, these are the rights we have? Do you have any idea? If you didn't know what the rights were and the Bill of Rights hadn't been written yet, how would you draw up a list of our rights? And you can't refer to the Bill of Rights. You got to refer to something else because it doesn't exist yet. Well, see, I know that the founders of this country had a clear understanding, which is articulated in the Declaration. Think about our discussion of endowment. If you want to know what are the terms of an endowment, who do you have to ask? You could look at a document if one existed, but if you can't find the immediate document, but the person who actually gave the endowment is available, couldn't you go ask them? Sure you would. So if God has endowed our rights, who do you think has determined the content of those rights, what they are? God, obviously. A God-endowed right is determined by God. Its terms are laid out by God. So when the Declaration says we have God-endowed unalienable rights, what's it talking about? The key to finishing the logic is in the word unalienable. The word unalienable means that one way to explain it is often that you can't give it away, it can't be taken away. But it actually means what the word literally conveys. Break it apart. Unalienable, unable to be alienated. And alienated means to make something strange to me, to make something other than I am, right? So that it's no longer compatible with or capable of being part of what I am. That's what it means to alienate. That's why we use the term alien sometimes to mean.
Well, friend, that lesson, boy, oh boy, let it just get deep down in your soul. Our rights do not come from the Constitution. Our rights come from God. All right? They're simply codified in the Constitution. And if our form of government ever becomes destructive towards those God-given rights, as the Declaration of Independence said, it is our right, it is our duty to alter or abolish government that is destructive to our God-given rights. I encourage you, go to our website, watch Dr. Key's entire speech, take advantage of all the free material that we have for you so that you can be part of the resistance.